Thank you very much for everything. I'm going to go fast because it's just, okay, now 10 minutes. um, well, I'm part of the in Costa Rica, the youngest group within the Strategic Division, so this natural capital group. Myself and Andres, that is around here, we are hiring another person. And just we're beginning on calculating and estimating natural capital accounts. First, I wanted to introduce more or less something was already talked at the morning and before by my colleagues, how is natural capital. And I want to focus in, there, okay. I'm going to focus in basically what we want to do in Chile. Okay, so we have natural asset accounts, and we have different definition of natural assets. And for our country, it's very important mineral and energy resources. Okay, so because we are a country with copper, yes, that is, and also we are beginning a transition from to non-renewable, to non-conventional renewable energies. Also, it's very important what is land use and land cover accounts, because that are an input for the ecosystem accounts. Also, forest resources and biological resources like fishing, fisheries in the country. On the other hand, the central framework on environmental accounting has different flow accounts, and many of them, most energy, air emission, water pollution, and solid waste can be compiled at the beginning. These are the final three, that's environmental taxes, environmental expenditures, environmental goods and services. That is something that already Scott was presented before, are still something that we can do, but we need more information. For example, for environmental goods and services, we don't have such a granularity as in the States to separate what are the environmental goods or not, okay? And in the case of ecosystem accounts, we can have a conversation between provisioning services with the natural assets that are basically similar to the abiotic resources. So here we have energy, we have minerals that are also here in the central framework. So what is the difference is that environmental, in the case of ecosystem accounts, are geospatial explicit. That means that we need to put in a map or mapping these ecosystem services in Chile. So that is a difference. That requires a lot of information, requires a lot of effort. And within these ecosystem accounts, what is more challenging is regulating services. Because, for example, flood protection, soil fertility, pest control, erosion, carbon sequestration, water flow maintenance, pollination. Why? Because these ecosystem services are intangible. So you cannot see the product. So you can see the water, you can see the energy, but the services that are provided by regulated services you cannot see explicitly. So how calculate this? How can we calculate this? And this can be done in different ways. Let me go here. And these are the accounts from the ecosystem accounts. A stock account of extent of the ecosystem is basically the location and the size of each ecosystem. And conditional accounts have to be with the quality of the ecosystem, the productivity of the ecosystem. And after these two are inputs to estimate the ecosystem services in terms of flow or in later in evaluation in terms of asset, physically and also in monetary terms. So what is a system account? Is a classification of the ecosystem in spatial explicit terms in terms of location and area occupied by the ecosystem. And main issue here is what classification to use. So United Nations proposed different levels to estimate or to calculate this or to classify these ecosystems. So from the more general, the realm, that's terrestrial, freshwater, marine, subterranean transition, to more specific, the biome, and later the ecological and functional groups that are more than 100. So here the main issue is what classification to choose. And that is not an agreement actually among countries. We don't have any standardization. The same happened for the case of quality or condition accounts. What indicator to choose to have these condition accounts? For different characteristics of the ecosystem in terms of quality, we have different indicators category, and we have different examples of indicators. Many can be estimated, but what happens is that they need to be calculated by remote sensing or by monitor in the field. Around the world, there are a lot of experience, but of flow accounts from the central framework, mainly in the United States. In the rest of the world is less abundant, and for the natural asset accounts, it is similar. This is because Eurostat has a guideline and has a regulation on how to produce these accounts. In terms of ecosystem accounts, it's basically Europe. Europe is developing a lot of pilot accounts that probably in the future will be more regular. So that is compared to the difference with the other part of the world. Okay. So that is to say what is the experience of. In Chile, we are, by our law, who are in charge of the national accounts, the Central Bank of Chile. We also are as part of the OECD Formal Expert Group on Natural Capital. The Central Bank also is a member of the network of the central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, working not only in climate, but also nature-related financial risk framework and data. And also we participate as advisor to the Natural Capital Committee. That is Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Economy. And finally, something important that the Ministry of Environment, we have a representative here, compiles many environmental indicators that are relevant for natural capital accounting. So this is the framework that we have, and what we want to do is have a hybrid implementation. So at the same time, advance in the central framework in the ecosystem accounting, where methodologies and data are available. So land use, marine resources, mineral energy emissions, ecosystem extend accounts and condition accounts, and mainly provisioning ecosystem services. Regulating ecosystem services are very important, but because their nature are more difficult to estimate. So for that, we are dealing now with methodological information and issues for do these estimations. And here it's important that there is a collaborative work. The Natural Capital Committee is leading a pilot of natural capital intended to support public policy. So in the south of Chile, there is a pilot for estimation of ecosystem services. So we are working as advisor there. And what is our main product in the short term, short run, is to do a land use and land cover account. Why? Because that provides us the basis to have different natural capital accounts. First, land cover mapping is input for ecosystem extent accounting, also for ecosystem condition accounting, and also for ecosystem services, flow and asset accounting. And also, it's not here, is the monetary land use accounts. Why is important monetary land use account? Because they can provide us a driver for the change in cover. Yes? So this is our main product in the short term. We are using artificial intelligence in this case. And also, so there you have an example of land use cover. And what the challenges first, for example, for the case of accounting for mineral resources, to have adopt a new classification for measuring economic resources and reserves. So the classifications from the CEA, CF that are now being adopted by the revision of the CNEA is not the same that are being used in Chile. So we need to reclassify the mineral resources. Secondly, how to identify the contribution of non-conventional renewable resources. We need how to, using from the supply and use tables. Later, for ecosystem accounts, modeling physical system services for a territory where climate and ecosystem are diverse. There are models to estimate ecosystem services, but those models are global, have to be adapted to the case of Chile. And the Chile is diverse in terms of territory, and in some climate and some kind of territories, the models work well, and others not so well. So we need to work with that. And later, the evaluation of the regulated services is a work in progress. So there is no agreement. You can use replacement costs, avoiding costs, but still is something that is no agreement in the literature and in the expert. For both cases of both frameworks, something important is, for example, how to calculate the price of natural asset or provision ecosystem service is to estimate physical capital at the resource level and private return for the physical capital also at the resource level. Dealing with situational framework for valuation of natural resource and ecosystem services, because some resources are open access. Being open access, the value of the resource goes to zero. So how to value something that the institutional framework leads to a zero value? Probably a cost-based approach. Finally, modeling and imputing data for small and medium agents where information is less abundant and precise. And here, finally, I wanted to show you why it could be complex to estimate ecosystem services or some ecosystem services is because this variety of ecosystem, variety of climate, and variety of kind of water flows. In each case, probably the characteristics are very specific in terms of spatially. And so the information needed to calculate the ecosystem services, for example, are very particular to each, for example, catchment, each of these different colors. And for that, we can use remote sensing, so satellites, yes, but we also need expertise and field data to input the ecological production function of the ecosystem services. So that is my presentation. So thank you for everything. I'm open for the question. Bye.
Thank you, Enrique. So now we have some time for some questions. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and then say your name, your question, and who you're asking the question to.
Thank you for your presentation. Okay. I'm Rodrigo Arrega from the Ministry of the Environment here in Chile. This is a question for all of you. You sort of mentioned this in some of your presentations, but this is something related with institutional arrangements to provide the information that you need to construct all these accounts. It makes no sense, and probably it's going to be not very efficient that here in Chile, the central boss start producing environmental data, right? Because we have other kind of institutions that are already working on that. So Costa Rica, you also mentioned the kind of relation that you have with the Ministry of the Environment and other institutions. So can you provide some examples of specific institutional arrangements that you're using to make sure that the data that others provide, even at the level of a university or research centers, can fit into these accounts? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. My question will be for Scott and Monica. In your experience, what will be your recommendation for those countries that are in the process of implementing national accounts right now?
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I would like to ask, I am Marta Tobar. I would like to ask to the colleague of the BEA and maybe to the colleague of Chile, in this case of the environmental accounts that are very challenging and it's a very novel topic, I would like to know, and maybe the BEA colleague mentioned it in the presentation, what are the reactions in the policy advice strategy of the governments regarding these accounts, if there is any, and also what is the approach of the users if you have tested these exercises, what are the response of the users to these statistics? Thank you.
Well, thank you for great presentations. 2 comments and 1 question. First comment is I always find it extremely useful to have these use cases to show how these data that's being developed is actually put to use. Second comment is a specific point that Enrique made on the measurement of land. I briefly mentioned this morning. I can only encourage you to do this. I think it's a really big asset, such a fundamental type of asset for those countries that have full accounts already. This is a big part of the national wealth. In France, this constitutes about 40% of national wealth is the value of land. So really, I mean, we need to progress on this. My question is one that is, where do you draw the line in terms of the usefulness of going to monetary valuation? Okay, of the assets. I mean, some things are obvious. I think when it comes especially to the regulatory services that you were mentioning, it becomes, of course, very tricky to measure those in monetary terms. It would be very interesting to have it, but it's also very difficult to do, and there are costs and benefits to putting this or actually investing in the monetary valuation. So I'd just like to get your sense from basically all the contributors about where to draw the line here.
Okay, so maybe we can start by you, Scott, then Monica, and then Enrique.
Sure. Yeah, I can start. So we had a few different questions directed my way, I think. So one about regarding the institutional arrangements. So the BEA is in the US is part of a fairly disaggregated statistical system. We have many statistical agencies across the federal government. And as a result, we are very reliant on data from agencies across the federal government. So we actually produce relatively little data ourselves, or collect relatively little data ourselves. Tina highlighted one of the few data collection efforts that BEA actually does itself in-house. So we are very used to working with other agencies who collect some of the primary source data. And we already have a lot of existing relationships with the agencies that collect the economic data, but we don't have as many of those relationships with the environmental data collection agencies. And we are forming those, and we have and formed some ties in recent years. And so I think that is a bigger obstacle for national statistical offices, because unlike working with economic data, environmental data is just sort of a different animal in many ways. And so so that is one of the bigger challenges that not only the US has, but many other countries around the world have, as I understand it, is bridging those those ties between statistical agencies that are used to collecting economic data with those who are collecting environmental data. The second question was regarding advice that the U.S. or folks from the U.S. that are working on this may have. One piece of advice I would have is that, or at least one approach that we've taken within the U.S. is a lot of our accounting work has originated within the research groups within our statistical agencies. And we've really focused on trying to get the methodology and the data right before producing the accounts. There is this tendency to try to do too much too quickly, and maybe to the, I think there's a balance, I think, that was talked about in earlier presentations about how policymakers need information very quickly in a timely way. This is very true for economic data, but given the sort of the nature and the complexity of natural capital accounting and environmental economic accounts, that there are a lot of difficult challenges and methodological issues that are orders of magnitude more complex in environmental economic accounting, where you can get ranges of estimates that are very large or unacceptably large compared to our economic data, where errors of relatively small bands are we have errors and revisions in our economic data, but depending on the methodology that we would use with environmental economic accounts, we could have very large revisions if we pursued a certain methodology. So that's something that we have to sort of keep in mind with natural capital accounting, that the methodology and the data is very important, and we have to try to get that right. I think the other question was about sort of the user response to some of our projects. I can't speak too much to the U.S. because our efforts to this point have largely been research efforts and not official accounts. But my impression from the countries that have produced these as official accounts around the world is that policymakers and users of the data have found this increasingly useful, especially if these accounts are collected on a very timely basis and recurring year after year, rather than just sort of one-off pilot studies. Those are useful for getting the methodology and the data developed, but from a user standpoint, something that's regularly produced at regular intervals has been the most helpful. I think those are all the questions, so I'll stop. Yep.
Thank you. Monica.
Well, okay. About the institutional arrangements, I think that in Costa Rican experience is very important, and the constitution of this National Council of Environmental Accounts. And something very important of this council is that it was constituted by executive decree. So we have a specific law arrangement that ask for work every month. So we have to be attending meetings and meeting with the other institutions to follow up what we are doing in the central bank regarding the technical application of the accounts. So that's a very important thing that works in Costa Rica very well. That is also important because, as Scott mentioned, we at the central bank work with economic information, and we are all economists, and this can be hard for economists to start working with the spatial information, for example. So in this group, with this council, with the other institutions, we have been receiving support from other experts in other institutions to how understand information, what is official in the country. For example, when we need to use a forest map, the environmental ministry give us advice of what is the best source of information, what is the official, what map are they using for the NDCs or for the other policies, for example. And this is something very important, to have a strong communication with the other ministries or agencies that have in charge the environmental production in the country. About the recommendations and advices, I think that to start in this, it's important to define what is the policy priority. What do you want to focus first? Because there is a lot of work, and it's important to know what is the main policy questions that you have in your country and you want to answer first. And also start looking for what kind of information do you have in your country to start, and if it's enough information, or if you have to find new resources or develop new surveys, for example, to build the account that you want to. And also is to inform. I think that it's very important that all the institutions related with the topic that you want to work on are informed that you are working on that, because the communication between institutions is very important when you are trying to develop something new and something like the accounts, environmental accounts. Also, I think that it's very important to keep in mind that this is a topic that is related with very different disciplines, not only the economists, and are looking for this data. And I think that it's very important to find a multidisciplinary team with different knowledge and areas of expertise, because that enrich the kind of analysis that you can develop in the country. Okay, this is for my side.
Enrique.
Thank you. With respect to the institutional arrangements, I will say that, well, we are working now in the Natural Capital Committee. So there is a lot of collaboration in terms of in terms of ecosystem services. We have this pilot that but the committee has this pilot in the south of Chile. We're just at the beginning of this pilot, and will be very helpful to know how to proceed estimating ecosystem services in different way, not only in physical terms, but also what you say, valuation. Valuation is very important, but it's also very difficult. So probably when this work proceed in the following months, we are going to realize what are the barriers or what is the advantage of valuing and ecosystem services. In particular case, the case of regulating ecosystem services. So there's something that already we don't know. It's probably a work in progress. Okay, so but already we know that obtaining physical ecosystem services values is important, and is a first step for for public policy everywhere, not only here in Chile, but in the rest of the world. Okay. Yes, we know that. Okay, that was very important. We understood that land is crucial for ecosystem service and for everything. And that is the case why we choose to begin working in land use and land cover, because affect everything. So I think that this is a very good product and very important for the country. And how you say that the experience around the world with ecosystem services show that land values are very important, probably the most important natural capital asset. So for that, I think that it's important to begin to work in this case. The use by government of this natural capital, well, for us, this land use, land cover is important because deals with degradation of ecosystem services and also with climate change. And we have an interaction between degradation of ecosystems and climate change that we need to address. And that is very important for the central bank because we are in the NGFS. NGFS is working, developing some models to understand the relationship between climate and nature-related financial risk. So we need this information for that. So that is a priority for the central bank, but I think it's also a priority for the country. I would say that basically. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we will finish with some questions for each one of you. You have touched upon these issues in your presentations and in your answers, but maybe I can be more specific about some issues that you discussed. So Enrique, given that we're in Chile, what do you think are the main mechanisms through which ecosystem degradation and its services can impact economic growth here in Chile?
Okay, thank you. How you say before, well, first, if we have deforestation, we don't have so much deforestation, but in the case of deforestation and degradation of ecosystem services, we have this modify the biochemical cycle, yes, and that minimizes the resilience and resistance of ecosystem to climate change and to other kind of degradations. Because of that, we have less provision of provision services, but also from regulating ecosystem services. So that could be basically a physical explanation on how can degradation of ecosystem affects economic growth. I think my impression is that the interaction between climate change and ecosystem degradation is very important because we don't see, we are a country in which we have some changes, you know, in terms of the landscape. But those changes are really slow. But climate change is already in Chile. You know, we have 10 years of a drought in the central Chile. We have a browning of the natural forest here in the mountains, and we don't know if the forests are recovering. And we are losing ecosystem services there, and we are losing, for example, touristic activities and other kind of ecosystem services. So climate change being every year worse probably will produce an effect on the degradation of ecosystem services that affects more and more over the growth of the country probably. And opposite to that, I have to say not only for ecosystem services, but the case for natural capital in general, we are a country based on natural resources. So for us, it's important to have these estimations.
Thank you. So, Monica, you mentioned that since you're economists, sometimes it's hard to compute some things that maybe require some other skills. But in terms of data challenges, what would you say were the main challenges that you faced and that any country trying to measure these things would probably encounter? And how do you overcome these kind of challenges?
Well, in our experience, what important challenge, it's on. Yeah, okay. One important challenge is that it has been very hard for us to find congruent and consistent information. And that we're publishing periodically in the official sources. For example, in the forest account, it has been very difficult to us to update it because the maps, the institution in charge of the maps are not working constant in that information, so we can do more work on that topic because of that kind of source of information. And I think that this is something important if the countries are thinking to implement national environmental accounts. It's to evaluate how official and consistent and congruent is the information that they need to implement the accounts. Also, I think that it's very important to understand very well the information that we are working on. For that, and it's important to have the support of other disciplines and other experts in the country to at the end bring accounts that represent the reality in the country and were useful for the policy decision making. Yes, in Costa Rica, the problem is the lack of information. That's very hard for us to produce accounts constantly and in the period that we want. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that is related to something that Scott talked about the revisions, the large revisions in the data, right? How do you handle that? How do you? So you revised the whole series, and you just.
Yeah. So at least with the economic data in the national accounts, when we have, in some cases, large revisions, policymakers and the general public. That's one of the things that draws their attention most, and so there is this institutional. Bias, I guess, against of having large revisions,
Right.
But with environmental data that is, and as it was just said, that sometimes environmental data is produced on a 5-year schedule or a 10-year schedule in some cases. There are some surveys that are produced in the U.S., I think of the forests, I believe, that are done every, like a 10-year census of the forest, and then they have like smaller surveys from year to year. But you can imagine in those cases, you could have potentially very large revisions because of the nature of the data collection just being so infrequent. And so that's one of our big worries with natural capital accounting, is that the environmental data itself may not, it may not be available, or if it is available, it's not at increments which align very well with the economic data. We're used to having quarterly estimates of GDP, for example, or yearly estimates of various accounts. And I think that's going to be the expectation for many environmental economic accounts, that we have data produced at finer time increments, but if the environmental data doesn't align very well with those time increments, it's going to be very difficult for us to produce estimates that are that don't have large revisions to them.
Okay, thank you. And related to that, and a question for the three of us, actually, what do you think are the key uses of the data that you are collecting and that you are producing? Monica talked about some uses in her presentation, and you also mentioned that this data is used mainly for research, if I understood correctly. Do you think that is the main uses that you're seeing, or this is just the tip of the iceberg and you see this going forward and being used for policy, and then the revisions become very important, and the frequency of the data? How do you see this in the future? We'll start with you and then we'll go that way.
So a lot of the sort of the more fine-grained data is used for research purposes. However, at least in the US, where in this last year, in January, we had released a national strategy related to developing environmental economic accounts over the next 10 years. And one of the main takeaways from that strategy document that was a joint document produced by the Office of Management and Budget, the Department of Commerce, and the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy. One of the main takeaways from that policy document was that natural capital accounting is essential because we can't manage what we're not measuring. And if we're not measuring the environment or various aspects of our environmental assets, that it becomes difficult for policymakers to make various decisions, including trade-offs, evaluating economic trade-offs. And I think this goes to one of the questions that was asked earlier about the importance of monetary valuation, is that there are many aspects of our environment that we don't have very good estimates for their monetary value. And that becomes difficult for a policymaker to make an economic decision about the trade-offs versus, development or some other use of those resources, or how much to devote to resource management for that particular environmental asset, or any number of questions for policymakers. And so having more information about how much these assets are worth, or what kind of output and goods and services come from these assets, and so on and so forth. Having more information, I think, is going to be essential for policymakers in the future, going forward.
Okay. I was thinking, because this is a very hard question, because for sure, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are many uses for the environmental accounts or the environmental data. And I think that, we are starting a new age of information. We are understanding that it's important to also have knowledge about what happens in the environment, what is going on in the resources, natural resources that every country has. And what I want to use or say in this space is that we are in Central Bank, we are trying to understand how we can use the environmental accounts to understand or to using indicators related with climate change in the country. I think that this is an application that is starting around in different countries, and we are trying to understand how we can use the information that we already have, for example, the energy emissions, how we can relate with the pressure on the economy, or the precipitation that we use for the water account, how we can use that to understand the Niño in the country and the impact of the Niño in the country. To be honest, I don't have a question for a specific answer for you, because there are many applications, and I hope that as we start thinking in this topic in the future, in the next conference, we talk about more new applications of this information.
Thank you. Enrique?
Okay, I don't know how to say this. A lot of very good answers from my colleagues. I already talked about what the central bank is doing with this climate-related and nature-related financial risk analysis. So that is basically one use here in the central bank. but also this natural capital committee. Yes, that is the aim is basically to include, incorporate natural capital in the public policies. So there's a lot of application. Maybe I'm not the person who has to say that. It's Rodrigo. He knows better than me the answer. But this is had to do also with the, for example, regulations on instruments. Just one use is our instrument from the public policy point of view. Not only regulatory instrument, but also economic instrument. So subsidies and taxes. Yes. And that probably is also a very interesting future research area. We have in all around the world different uses of taxes and subsidies that affect the environment, affect the natural capital, degradation and deforestation and everything. So probably this interaction between economic instruments, that information with information of natural capital accounting is very interesting to see in the future. So I will say that, and for our case, from what we are proposed to do, this land use, land cover mapping is a public good. So we want to create this for everyone to use for any kind of analysis. So for research, for public policy, for different things. So I think this is very important, and hopefully will be something that will value in the future. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to the three of you for very interesting discussions and presentations and discussion. And with this, we finish the session.